Before 1900, doctors had not understood why some transfusions caused bad reactions and even death. Landsteiner thought there might be different kinds of human blood. From studying these results, it was found that there are 4 different kinds of human blood, or 4 blood groups. Landsteiner's discoveries solved one major difficulty standing in the way of successful blood transfusion, but another remained.
Blood was highly coagulable. The addition of citrate helped maintain the blood in a liquid fashion. Russian physicians pioneered the collection and storage of cadaver blood.
A triumph in the study of blood is a new test that detects the mysterious Rh blood factor.
There are probably hundreds of blood types.
The push to separate whole blood into its individual components really started blood banking.
Blood plasma, a recent and important discovery of medical science, provides a permanent bank for use in transfusion. Furnished by volunteer civilian donors, the blood plasma may be stored indefinitely and given to any patient without risk. Thousands of men and women are donating blood for the Red Cross National Blood Bank to furnish plasma for emergency transfusion.
Researchers are now looking frantically for acceptable and plentiful substitutes for plasma.
Instead of the traditional, easily breakable glass bottle, whole blood to be shipped is today enclosed in unbreakable plastic containers.
Dr. Cooley has done thousands of cases of cardiac surgery without transfusion.
All these men down here, they only get $5 a pint for their blood, but we're striking this blood bank.
You had virtually 100% chance of acquiring hepatitis B from being transfused.
We're going to have 1 million outpatient visits a year from AIDS and AIDS-related illness.
I will do all that God gives us the power to do to find a cure for AIDS.
But now we know every one of us could be devastated by it.
That they had a medication that was infected with the AIDS virus. They took the product off the market in the U.S. and then they dumped it in France, Europe, Asia, and Latin America.
Every time we make blood safe, that step is going to add cost and at the same time may not guarantee us complete protection.
If you get my blood, you will now have my DNA.
So we are dramatically expanding the use of DNA evidence to prevent wrongful conviction.
For the first time in its history, the National Security Council got directly involved in combating a virus, HIV.
The government's scientific committee recommended the use of a filter for transfusion. When is the government going to react to that recommendation?
That recommendation is obviously very important for the future of the blood transfusion service. I will look at it very carefully and I'll get back to him.
200 million units of donated blood are needed worldwide. 80 million transfusions are administered each year. The shrinking donor availability means global blood resources are in short supply.
We as physicians have all taken a very basic oath, and that is the Hippocratic Oath, and it's to try to do good for mankind, and it also has the corollary of first do no harm.
Above all, do no harm. It makes a lot of sense to think of it as a first principle of healthcare.
When it comes to blood transfusion, it seems as though we have not really understood that, in that we've never done the basic research to know when we're doing good and when we're doing harm.
Many would say, and there is a large worry, that this therapeutic, among the world's most common administered therapeutics, millions upon millions of units transfused worldwide, may make people worse in many instances. And this is a great, great concern.
The scientific evidence has been slow in coming to document the fact that transfusion alters a lot of things in the organism, and it has long-term side effects. It's some kind of very gross modality of treatment. You give a bag of blood, and the bag of blood has all sorts of things in it, and we ignore them.
Blood transfusion came into medical practice virtually through the back door. Normally, therapies or medication used in modern medical practice would have been tried, and then it would be licensed.
Blood transfusion has never undergone randomized clinical trials to the level at which a new drug would have to go through the FDA. It's never been done.
Doctors try a whole lot of stuff, but if they're knowingly harming a patient, and by harm, I think I mean all things considered, the patient is worse off as a consequence of having this intervention, then that's a betrayal of medicine.
My plea to any prospective patient is always to ask why? What is the likelihood that a transfusion will be required? What's going to happen to me either if I have it or if I don't have it?
In the early days of asepsis in Vienna, Austria, Dr. Schimmelweis noticed that the midwives had many fewer infections than did the physicians, who often were touching many different patients or even actually coming from the morgue.
The docs would go from the autopsy room into a delivery room, didn't change the gloves, didn't change their coats, didn't wash their hands, just went from one table to the other. The physicians had a horrible death rate related to post-delivery sepsis of the moms. Same population of moms, midwives were delivering mothers, their death rate was much less. Schimmelweis goes, well, why are they having less sepsis, less illness and morbidity? And made the simple observation that you need to wash your hands between patients. He introduced that idea to his team and said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're just going to wash. Just use regular antiseptic solution and wash, and his moms started surviving at much higher rates. There was no basis for anyone to believe him, plus he was a pretty colorful character apparently as well. And what he was suggesting just sounded outrageous, even though he did have evidence. He had data.
Las observaciones de Semmelweis son observaciones de sentido común. son observaciones de la vida diaria, son observaciones de alguien inteligente que está tratando de ver algo. Y sin embargo, en su tiempo fueron rechazadas, objetadas y su autor perseguido.
He was drummed out of the business, basically, because it was not traditional. The influence of the politics and the fraternity of medical professionals at the time was such that it was simply unacceptable to consider that anything so simple could be the reason for the difference in survival.
People are actually thinking it is all due to demons or devils coming in, till a simple solution Semmelweis brought in of hand washing, and that prevented all this sepsis. So that's a simple solution. So many things in medicine may have a simple solution, but people are reluctant to accept because something is simple.
The Semmelweis principle is the knee-jerk rejection of anything new, because again, it challenges the norms.
Now that evolution of that thought of, well, there's a connection here, can I improve outcome, could actually translate into what happens in transfusion.
It serves to illustrate the bias that we physicians have, which is that we really truly believe in what we know, in the way things are done now. And it's the biggest challenge, I think, to practicing physicians, to always be aware of and awake to the possibility that something better is coming along, something new and different, maybe even something contrary to what we believe is the right thing to do. We have to always be open to consider a new idea, even if it flies in the face of everything we think is true.
Alexis Carrel, a Frenchman, is considered the father of vascular surgery. Carrel also was very interested in transplantation. In fact, the story was that he tried to transplant everything from one animal to another. He transplanted skin, he transplanted kidneys, he transplanted liver. Actually, Dr. Carrel was one of the first physicians to perform blood transfusions, which is in fact a transplant. Every young surgical resident learns about the Carrel anastomosis. That is, connecting one vessel to another vessel. Many, many surgeries would not be available today without this type of technique. Interestingly, Dr. Carrel took chicken embryo heart cells and put them in a flask and kept on feeding it, and feeding it and feeding it and feeding it, giving it the appropriate nutrients and whatever the cells needed. Fascinatingly, these cells lived for years. This was called the immortal cell. He was very, very intelligent and very much of a scientist, and yet believed that he was able to keep these cells alive and make these cells immortal. Many people believed him for a long time, until 30 or 40 years later, when evidence disproves what his original theory was. So the takeaway message from that is that smart guys aren't always right. I think it's only human nature to feel like you understand something and then dogmatically believe in that. This happens in medicine all the time, unfortunately.
In the present war, prompt administration of plasma has saved the lives of many victims of explosion burns and lacerations.
There clearly are benefits to transfusion. I've written books about it. I've transfused probably thousands of patients in my career. I know I've saved lives with transfusion. Unfortunately, medicine has taken to heart this public perception of give a unit of blood, save a life.
Every 2 seconds, someone in this country needs blood.
I needed 987 pints of blood to live.
All of the physicians who practice are brought up in the society where they hear, ever since birth, the public relations message of save this child's life, donate a unit of blood. They don't hear the very difficult academic discussion of when to give a unit of blood and when not to.
When you talk to lay people think we know exactly what we're doing and when to start, how much to give, what to give, and when to stop. And in fact, from a data-driven fashion, we don't know those things.
We have historically been trained that blood is good. There is nothing but benefit by transfusing patients.
In the healthcare system, blood was something you gave out like you gave out aspirin. It was something we did without even giving it a second thought.
At the moment, a physician can request blood on any patient.
В 70-е годы, я помню, кому мы только не переливали кровь. Там у человека какой-то упадок сил, мы ему назначали переливание крови. Какое-то инфекционное заболевание, мы назначали ему переливание крови. Даже для лечения вот у юноши, которые появляются угри на лице, и то мы применяли переливание крови. Было такое тоже. Это во всем мире было такое.
What has happened over the years is things become embedded in medical practice by tradition. Some respected member of the community starts to do something and talks about it with his or her scientific colleagues, and they try it, and it seems to work for their patients, and so gradually the word spreads.
We use this drug or therapeutic transfusion differently than any other therapeutic. We almost never give it to make a person better. That is to say, if we were to give it back freely and restore normal levels, I think most would agree patients would not do well.
Many clinicians think of blood and blood components as a drug to treat specific conditions that patients have.
Blood is a very complex organ that we transfuse as the means of transplanting it.
Now, because of the ability to store and deliver blood on demand, this happens to be the only transplant that all you require is essentially a couple of letters behind your name and a pen, and you can write for it.
A blood transfusion is the only organ transplant that's done by a nurse. Yet a doctor writes it on a piece of paper, a nurse hangs it. It has huge implications for patients.
There's been a tradition in medicine that when people order a unit of blood, they were told by someone, we still don't know who it was and what the reasons were, that if you're going to give a single unit of blood, there's no need to do that, you should give 2. And for many decades, people order units of blood as a couple rather than as single. Every unit has its own risk, and the risks are additive.
When everybody believed that transfusion was safe, it was incredibly easy and straightforward. Everybody could tell you a story of the person who got a 2-unit transfusion and felt immediately better. And everybody wanted to believe, and did believe, that the transfusion was a good thing.
The mindset of most physicians is this is a benign, if not quite beneficial treatment that doesn't cost them anything, makes the patient think that they feel better, they look a little pinker, so it's all okay, because no one's going to ask any questions anyway.
If they're not challenged as to why they want that blood, not challenged as to an alternative therapy, then the blood is made available for them. And it's the line of least resistance.
Tradition and empiricism really, meaning we just started trying it out to see where we could use it and what were the consequences of that. And all this was done without anybody really saying, you know, shouldn't we study this to see what is the right circumstance for this to be used? How much do you need to give? When should it be given? And it's persisted through till today.
The establishment today would say that you can do pretty well without half of it. And I think the establishment needs to agree that we don't know if you can give it back in most circumstances and help you. So you can basically wait today in many places until you've lost half of your blood before anyone would give it back. It's interesting, right? You can lose half your blood and you don't give it back, and that's because we don't think we can make you better by giving it back unless you've lost at least half of your blood.
And to the nation's 69 schools of medicine is entrusted the responsibility of passing on unbroken the inheritance of medical knowledge, of indoctrinating each young student with the traditions and ethics of his chosen profession. Here he must spend 4 long years.
Really, physicians tend to practice the way they were taught as a young person in medical school. So a new idea has to find its way through essentially 3 stages. First being attacked as being outlandish, and then eventually being accepted, and then finally being taught. Each one of those stages could conceivably take almost a generation, a 20-year turnover of physicians. We don't have some fancy monitor that says, oh, they could use a unit of blood. What we use are surrogate measures, and the most common surrogate utilized is the hemoglobin level, and that's the level of the red stuff in your blood, or the hematocrit, which is the percentage of red blood cells that circulate in the bloodstream.
Back when I was in medical school, really anybody who had a hematocrit less than 35 was transfused. And we deemed success by if we got the hematocrit up to the normal range, 45. That's our only measure of success that we had. And if anybody had symptoms such as they were weak or tired, even if their hematocrit was in the mid-35 range, well, that's not normal. Well, a unit of blood will make them feel better. We were under, I believe, just treating people because that's the way that we were taught, and we never had any evidence-based medicine to suggest that we were doing any good. And more recently, obviously, we were possibly causing harm.
I think it's a good volume expander, and I think that's what we use it for more than anything. It's easy to measure a hemoglobin and see that it's low, give a unit of blood, and you know, 2 hours later you can check a hemoglobin and the hemoglobin is higher. So you feel like you've done something. Has it necessarily benefited the patient? I'm not convinced of that. It's perhaps benefited the people taking care of the patient, because, you know, hemoglobin at time X and then hemoglobin at time Y, and you've seen an appropriate change. The issue is whether that change means anything clinically.
Well, those surrogates are merely laboratory values, and they don't tell us the individualized need of a given patient for blood to be administered.
There are a lot of studies now that show that lower transfusion triggers are just as safe as higher ones, and sometimes even safer.
I have seen a lot of patients with hemoglobin that is very low, like maybe 5, 4, or 3, even as low as 2, and they survive. I have talked to a lot of doctors in the Philippines, and I said, what's your experience with these people with hemoglobins that are low? And they said, yes, they're walking, hemoglobins of 6, hemoglobins of 5. Now, why are these people surviving? Why are these people doing things? They are carrying sacks of rice, they are carrying water, they are farming, hemoglobin of 6 and 7. So there must be a reason to that. A lot of things could really be understood in the light of human physiology.
There's significant variabilities in average hemoglobins amongst different nations on the globe. If you're living up in the Himalayas, your average hemoglobin is going to be high. If you're in sub-Saharan Africa and you're exposed to both malaria and other diseases, your average hemoglobin will be extremely low. Some children run around with hemoglobins below 5 grams in sub-Saharan Africa and are never transfused because there is no blood available. So I think there are significant geographical variabilities, all of which can add to the lesson of how individuals survive under those circumstances.
The history of blood banking and transfusion is really intimately related with injury. And if you go back in history, as far back as you go, the first transfusions were related to injury.
In fact, blood as a therapy just sort of happened as a consequence of military. The World War II was really the genesis of blood banking and transfusion practice in this country.
It was out of that Second World War realism of being able to save a life with fresh whole blood that blood transfusion got its good name.
I think it was perceived as then as it was in a bottle, and that was red, life-giving blood that carried oxygen. I don't think anybody knew any of the nuances about whether, storage of blood reduced its oxygen carrying capacity. As far as people were concerned, if you lost the red stuff, you needed the red stuff back.
Today we'd like to pay tribute to the National Blood Donor Campaign with a special program by one of the hardest working entertainment groups in the Far East Command, the Corntones.
Hey, boy. That's right, we're the Corntones, a bunch of Army Signal Corps officers that kind of let our hair down after duty hours.
How about you, Don? When was the last time you visited the blood bank?
Oh, gee, Bill, I kind of know my way blindfolded around that place. I go in just about every 2 months. In fact, yeah, here it is. Here's my card,
here?
Bill.
7 pints of blood, Don.
That's right.
In other words, 1 more pint and you'll be qualified as a gallonier.
Right.
Well, that's something you can well be proud of. How did the rest of the Corntones stack up with you?
Oh, Bill, why don't you ask them?
How about it? Come in here.
Hi, Bill.
Dude, what outfit were you with in Korea?
I commanded L Company,
38th Infantry Regiment. Don has told me before, Jude, that you were wounded in action in Korea. Did you require any blood?
Fortunately, Bill, I didn't. But many of my men required blood. And on their behalf, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for giving your blood. Believe me, you saved a lot of lives.
The belief or the public relations of give a unit of blood, save a life continued on and continued on with the goal of getting the American public to participate and feel altruistic about giving a unit of blood.
Patriotic citizens are giving their blood to save the lives of their soldiers and sailors. 500,000 pints have been donated, and the Red Cross Blood Bank is accepting voluntary contributions at the rate of $2 million a year.
But you got to remember where that was and the context of where that was. That was in battlefield trauma, massive trauma.
It was empirical evidence because you could give blood to a soldier wounded on the battlefield and the soldier survived, and the inference was that It was the transfusion that saved that person's life, therefore, that's an indication for transfusion.
Those policies and concepts and thought processes were then implemented in some degree in the civilian community.
I think in the late 40s, early 50s, nobody really understood that there was necessarily problems with blood transfusions. And we didn't understand the infectious disease risks. We certainly didn't understand the lung injury risk. And I'm not sure people fully understood the immunologic risk back then. So I think giving blood was just part of practicing medicine.
Blood transfusion did work to save lives during World War II, when people were bleeding to death on the battlefield. What has happened with many procedures is they go from heroic results in one context to being overutilized.
There was very little science around when should it be used, where should it be used, how much should it be used, who will benefit from this. The 50s and 60s were really uncontrolled. I mean, it was whatever the physician wanted it to be. And physicians assumed a central role in making decisions for patients and did not incorporate patients into those decisions.
I want to make myself clear, Ken. It's within my responsibility to tell Ponch.
Don't. I'm warning you, Mark, don't. He's my son.
He's my patient. I'd rather have your okay, but I'm going to do what's best for him in any case.
More than most professions, the medical profession is a culture. Doctors are kind of unique in changing their name when they become members of this culture. They go from being John Jones to being John Jones, MD. It gets attached to their practical identity.
It's very easy to fall into the trap of saying, you know, I know what I'm talking about, therefore you should listen to me. And that's really paternalism in its worst form. Ethically, I think that patients are still being subjected to more paternalism than they should be.
I, working in the United States, of course, see blood married to patriotism, love of country, love of family, love of community. And while clinicians, both nurses and physicians, want to feel that they're above all that, it's the evidence that dictates practice, not any of this other social or cultural stuff. That really isn't true.
I would say that in medicine today, the utilization of blood transfusion has grown into a religion. Today, there are a number of us who are questioning this vision of give a unit of blood, save a life.
I'm interested in the appropriate use of blood in physicians using as little as possible.
The challenge for us is to make blood make you better, not find a circumstance where giving blood back won't make you worse, which is the current state of the art. An amazing state of the art, I'll tell you, amazing. We give blood in the hopes you won't get worse. Imagine telling a patient, I'm gonna give you this stuff, and I hope you won't get worse. And I'm giving it to you because if I don't give it to you, I think you're gonna get worse. Now, can I make you better? I don't know about that. Will I make you worse? Maybe.
Ни один спасенный этой кровью боец будет думать с сердечным волнением об этих людях. Сыны и дочери героического советского народа ничего не пожалеют, чтобы вернуть к жизни раненых доблестных воинов, с беззаветной решимостью защищающих каждую пять родной советской земли.
Надо сказать, что, наверное, СССР в этом плане, наверное, было в свое время прогрессивно. То есть, хотя были годы разрухи, 1924 год, всего 7 лет прошло после революции, а уже специальным декретом советской власти были обязаны создаваться банки по заготовке и хранению крови.
Blood banks, as we know them, I would recognize them, really started in World War I. Obviously spurred by all the combat casualties that were coming out, the advent of modern high-velocity weapons, machine guns, and high explosives and artillery, et cetera, created horrific wounds.
Because of the demands of wartime, which were actually driven by the need to have plasma in a lyophilized form, in a freeze-dried form that could be carried out into the battlefield and then reconstituted just using fluids, that really drove the collection of blood.
The accumulation by the Navy of blood plasma, a recent and important discovery of medical science, provides each ship's sick bay with a permanent bank for use in transfusion. Furnished by volunteer civilian donors through the agency of the American Red Cross, the blood plasma may be stored indefinitely and given to any patient without risk, regardless of his blood type.
Вот, по литературе тоже знаю, что действительно был такой период в истории в СССР, когда рекомендовалось с целью увеличения количества крови заготавливать трупную кровь. Инициатором этого направления был известный очень в то время, это в 30-е годы прошлого столетия, профессор Юдин.
There was an opportunity post-World War II to capitalize on the lessons learned during the war about the ease with which blood could be collected, people's willingness to donate blood. And because all of that was true, there began to be an industry.
I'm the manager of a savings bank with branches all over the country. But we are by no means an ordinary savings bank. In fact, our vaults contain something much more valuable. They contain flasks of life-giving blood and plasma. During 1948, nearly 300,000 men and women will each have given half an hour of their time and 2/3 of a pint of blood to maintain this service. When the blood transfusion service makes an appeal in your district, please volunteer to become a donor. I'm sure some of you here are already regular donors. Thank you, blood donors.
The blood banks, as they became more popular and got implemented into civilian medicine, there was a greater pressure on the blood bank directors and the blood banks to deliver red blood cells to larger and larger civilian elective surgery. Trauma centers started coming in the United States, and the pressures from an inventory management point of view overcame the priorities of clinical outcome associated with these new products.
In the 1950s and 60s, blood transfusion morphed into and away from the utilization of fresh whole blood towards a world in which we started to have just separated red blood cells and other coagulation components.
And frankly, the economic pressures of taking a unit of blood, and if you give that to one patient versus taking that one unit of blood and separating it out into 6 or 7 components that you can give now to multiple patients. Economically, that's a much more beneficial model for a blood bank business, which is what these blood banks are.
I don't know that anybody ever said why. You know, why do you need to transfuse this patient? Instead, the response was, let's make sure we have donors that we can call upon in order to meet that need.
The blood bankers have made the world responsive to the requests and needs of surgeons, anesthesiologists, critical care doctors. So there is always money in the bank. Those physicians who are using the products, the end users of the product, have just simply always got an open checkbook to write and take something out of the bank.
All these men down here, they only get $5 a pint for their blood. How much you go with it? $5, but we're striking this blood bank. We're going to take them one at a time. We're asking people to please cooperate with our picket line. We're asking $15 a pint for whole blood, $9 a pint for plasma. We feel it's a struggle for dignity.
The years prior to 1972, where hepatitis B was the biggest threat for blood safety, and since the average transfusion back in the early days was 4 units, you had virtually 100% chance of acquiring hepatitis B from being transfused. Many states enacted legal protection for blood collectors and transfusion practices known as blood shield statutes, which basically said everybody knows you get hepatitis B from a transfusion. So you, the consumer, cannot sue the hospital, the treating physician, or the blood center just because you get hepatitis B. The public felt that blood transfusion was so necessary that the risk of having hepatitis B was just one of those consequences that you would expect to get.
Donation of blood is a source of income for many people in developing countries. There is no control in terms of selection of donors. You got paid, you gave blood, and that was it. So any disease you're harboring certainly could enter into the blood system by delivery to a distribution center.
Number one collector of blood in the Philippines is the Philippine Red Cross. The source of blood is coming from blood banks, commercial blood banks. And the commercial blood banks gets their blood from paid donors who queue up almost like every week to sell their blood. And you can just imagine what kind of people they are. They survive on their blood. They sell their blood. And so you would imagine that these are people who are financially strapped, people who may not have the right nutrition to eat, people who may have diseases in their blood. One can easily understand why complications can really come in. Testing may not be that reliable. And so this is a source of problem.
At first, only gays and IV drug users were being killed by AIDS. But now we know every one of us could be devastated by it.
With the sudden and unexpected appearance in the early 1980s of a brand new transfusion-transmitted infection, just really set the profession back on its heels.
We now have every day 1,900 people in hospital beds with HIV illness. By 1993, we are going to need 4,000 to 5,000 hospital beds a day. We're going to have 1 million outpatient visits a year from AIDS and AIDS-related illness.
The impact had global consequences. The international distribution of materials, for example, the U.S. was at that time a very large exporter of plasma components for use in hemophiliacs globally. And as a practical matter, as just the financial circumstances of the world, as this knowledge was evolving, plasma that had the HIV virus in it was distributed globally.
That they had a medication that was infected with the AIDS virus. They took the product off the market in the U.S. and then they dumped it in France, Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The medicine's called Factor VIII. It was an injection medicine that was used for hemophiliacs, mostly children.
The transmission of HIV was not the only thing that we recognized. We also recognized hepatitis C. And probably, if you looked at transmission of disease, the killer, the largest killer, probably was hepatitis C rather than HIV. So something went wrong with this so-called therapy, if you will, which saved lives.
And the consequence of that subsequent data have shown is that the demand for or the use of blood began to drop. Having physicians not asking for blood to be transfused had no apparent ill effect on patients. In the 80s, stimulated a whole new way of thinking about how to keep blood safe.
While the American people, I think, can take heart from the fact that the nation's blood supply is safer than it has ever been, I must point out that I still have doubts that it is safe as it should and can be. It is the goal of this subcommittee. I believe it is the goal of the Red Cross, and I'm satisfied that it is the drug of the Food and Drug Administration, that we will move forward towards what will ultimately be the safest and the best blood supply for the people of this country.
Beginning in 1996-97, the demand for blood unexpectedly was rising very fast. And in fact, it rose much faster in the 5 years between 1997 and 2002 than the drop that had occurred over the 10 years prior to that time, and it has continued to this day. It's all about the physicians became comfortable that blood was safe again.
The blood bankers have done a fantastic job of eliminating the major risks of hepatitis C and AIDS, HIV. So those risks are vanishingly small, but all that does is uncover all the remaining risks of blood transfusion.
The story about the people from New Guinea and the incidence of cannibalism and the transmission of disease through either transfusing or transplanting or ingesting is one of the issues that makes the blood supply very vulnerable. Kuru is one of those families of the slow neurological diseases that is thought to be transmitted through prion or protein particles. Now that practice of cannibalism has been stopped and the disappearance of disease suggests again very closely that this was related to the ingestions of these particles through cannibalism.
Judy Kenny lost her husband Derek to new variant CJD. He'd been given 4 pints of blood in 1996 during an operation. He died of CJD 6 years later, and it was only because his wife complained they subsequently discovered one of those pints was contaminated.
Variant CJD and so-called mad cow disease, all thought to be prion-derived diseases, or some may be related to slow viruses that attack the central nervous system. And it's not till the last few decades where our understanding of particles rather than just viruses or bacteria has entered into the realm of transmissible disease. These are diseases which are extremely rare, but at the same time, the burden is enormous.
I'm sure the Prime Minister is aware that in percentage terms, the population of United Kingdom and Ireland are the biggest reservoir of the prion that causes the fatal and incurable human brain disease variant CJD. One of the means of transmission is blood transfusion. In October last year, the government's scientific committee looking at this recommended the use of a filter for blood for transfusion for children initially. When is the government going to react to that recommendation? Prime Minister.
This is a very serious matter that he raises in great detail. That recommendation is obviously very important for the future of the blood transfusion service. I will look at it very carefully and I'll get back to him.
We are spending in the UK more than 130 million a year in order to prevent this negligible risk.
The safety of the blood supply, such as in the UK with adding filters, is just one step in trying to prevent one particle or one agent in terms of entering into the supply.
And if we introduce the prion filter, I really don't believe in it because, it's nobody has ever found the prion in patients, in the peripheral blood of patients with variant CJD.
today it's 100 million pounds sterling for one agent. Tomorrow it may be 200 million sterling for another agent. So we will never reach the plateau in terms of making blood safety. There's always going to be something that we're going to need to do to maintain this safety, and of course that's always going to translate to added costs, which are significant.
I believe that UK blood is much safer. I wouldn't be transfused in the USA. And if I needed a transfusion, I would rather go have a transfusion in the UK.
The UK has probably one, if not the safest, blood supply in the world. What does that mean? That means that from an infectious agents that we are aware of, those have been able to be eradicated or removed from the blood supply. It doesn't make that blood supply not have any implication in terms of non-infectious risks, nor does it protect us from the future in terms of any other organism entering into that blood supply.
So every decade has kind of had its own new set of challenges, and we still haven't, we're still concerned that there are others to evolve.
The cost of a unit transfused in the early stages of the Iraqi war could have exceeded $9,000 per unit.
К сожалению, наверное, как и во всем мире, в России то же самое, увеличивается и увеличивается стоимость одной единицы крови. Если не переливать кровь, то это стоит гораздо дешевле. Если мы, наверное, еще возьмем, мы не считаем, к сожалению, во всем мире считают осложнения, которые могут возникнуть при переливании крови. Если это посчитать, то это, наверное, выйдет в адские деньги. Но мы, к сожалению, пока этого не считаем.
In Australia, when you get a transfusion, on average it's around 2 to 2.5 units. So every time somebody gets a transfusion in Australia, we're going to spend about $2,000. In the US, the estimate is a single unit of blood may cost as much as $1,200 per unit.
When we start looking at not only the cost of allogeneic blood transfusion, but also the negative outcomes associated with transfusion, I think that that's when hospitals start to recognize they're spending an inordinate amount of dollars or yens, wherever you are in the world, yet they're not achieving the relative outcome for that expense.
There is a risk of not being able to continue to maintain an available blood supply for the needs in the future. The ratio of those older persons who we now know receive blood transfusions at about 6 times the rate of the rest of the population, their numbers are growing quickly, so the ratio between older people being transfused and those donating blood is in fact declining quickly.
The need of blood increases continuously due to demographic changes. 20 years ago, nobody operated on patients with 80 years, but today this is routine.
There is a shortage, an acute shortage in the bank when you talk about voluntary donors. They're obviously shrinking all over the world, and definitely in areas where HIV endemicity is high. It's difficult to get donors. Then, of course, it's expensive. Those who have relatives or friends who are willing to donate for them, then they bring them along.
As blood's got safer, it seems to have got scarcer. And therefore, as hematologists, we've had to consider how best to use blood, but also what are the alternatives that we can use.
Это вообще уникальный человек, академик Андрей Иванович Воробьев. Ну, почему уникальный? Вот как уникальность его в том, как ученого. Ведь он первый у нас в стране создал мощную службу такую по заготовке и хранению крови. И он первый у нас в стране в конце 20 века, который начал говорить о том, что переливать кровь – это не так уж хорошо. Вот в этом уникальность его. То есть первый начал говорить, что надо заготавливать кровь, и первый, который начал пропагандировать то, что кровь, переливание крови не так уж хорошо для пациента. И вот у него есть одно великолепное выражение, которое я тоже всегда повторяю и студентам, и врачам во время лекции, о том, что кровь, выпущенная из организма, это уже не кровь. Это принципиально новая субстанция с новыми неизвестными свойствами. Кровь ее можно называть, когда она циркулирует в сосудах, в моих сосудах, в ваших сосудах, то есть в сосудах пациента. Когда выпустили, это совершенно уже другое вещество.
There are practically no repercussions of a moral nature. The principal concern is of another nature, whether this device, this mechanical device, will support his life.
There are remarkable people like Dr. Cooley down in Houston who has done thousands of cases of cardiac surgery in the early years before it was recognized you could do so without transfusion.
There are so many things about Dr. Cooley that, warrant your respect. It's almost impossible to name them all. I mean, he's sort of the consummate surgeon. I mean, he was fearless as a technical surgeon.
Now, this is a heart which we used in Mr. Karp to replace his own heart.
He would tackle anything in a time when a lot of what he was doing was unknown. He basically pushed the field of cardiovascular surgery into the forefront, and he, along the way, developed certain areas of interest and expertise that he then passed on to his students, of whom I was one. Certainly, he was one of the very first heart surgeons that agreed to operate in a bloodless manner. I think the last time I talked to him about it, he and his team had done 20 or 30 heart transplants without the use of any blood.
Dr. Cooley helped to establish a set of guidelines for cardiac surgery in the mid-1970s. If we had adopted his guidelines back in the mid-70s, before HIV became extremely rampant, we might have averted a lot of HIV-infected patients and deaths, because many of our HIV patients were secondary to blood transfusions, among other causes.
Практику я свою начал в 1974 году. После окончания института начал работать в Сибири, в регионе Кузбасса, где очень много было и есть шахт. И вот я помню, что был очень интересный случай, когда одного шахтера завалило во время взрыва в шахтах, у него полностью ноги были завалены, и туда спустился мой ученик, Руслан его звать. И вот на месте он произвел уникальную операцию. То есть невозможно было достать шахтера, он произвел ампутацию одной ноги, одновременно обезболил этого шахтера, одновременно ввел кристаллоиды внутривенно. А надо все это понимать, что это в условиях шахты, где пожар, где все падает. У него одна лампочка на лбу только, которая освещает. И вот, тем не менее, этого шахтера 4 часа длилась эта операция. Потом почти 6 часов его доставляли на поверхность в клинику. То есть прошло время 10 часов. И этот шахтер потерял более 75% объема циркулирующей крови. То есть критически. И тем не менее он 10 часов прожил, этот шахтер. Его лечили, и через месяц он, правда, на одной ноге, но тем не менее он здоровым ушел домой. Уникальный случай, и за этот случай вот этого врача Руслана правительство наградило орденом. Вот в том числе и из этого случая я тогда сделал вывод и начал задумываться о том, что а зачем переливать кровь? Если человек прожил без переливания крови определенный промежуток времени, много часов, то какой смысл ему в дальнейшем переливать кровь? Я не вижу этого смысла. И с тех пор, наверное, я начал этими проблемами заниматься в научном аспекте.
Early on in my life, medicine I thought would be the opportunity of a lifetime for me to be able to help people. I recognized at some point in my career that I didn't understand what blood components do, nor did I understand when to appropriately use blood components. I also recognized that my colleagues were in the same place, but for some reason were accepting that as a practice. I'm a clinician who is not only an advocate, but a spokesman for my patients. This case may have been one where the enormity of lessons were unprecedented in many ways. It was a relatively young individual who had a gastrointestinal bleed in another hospital. The patient ended up with a significant low hemoglobin of around 2 grams. And we had already started our bloodless program, and his wife was looking high and low for a place that would take care of him because the physicians in that particular institution had absolutely no knowledge, nor do they have the capability, they felt, to care for him, and essentially were hoping for the best, which, as you know, is not a plan. The big lesson for us was that we were searching what to do for somebody who had a hemoglobin of 1.7, which in my training was incompatible with life.
I understand you got a phone call from the hospital that transferred him?
Yeah, they wanted to know when he actually passed away. They were shocked to find out that he actually survived.
Before 1900, doctors had not understood why some transfusions were successful, while others caused bad reactions and even death. But in 1901, Landsteiner, a young scientist in Vienna, thought there might be different kinds of human blood, which might account for blood not always mixing properly when transfused from one person to another.
Landsteiner received the Nobel Prize in the early 1930s for a very simple discovery, and that simple discovery was that on the surface of every red blood cell, there's a group of molecules that distinguish it as having a specific blood type. Prior to his discoveries, whenever somebody would give a transfusion, there was a significant chance, and it was really about 40–50% chance that you would get the wrong blood type and that could conceivably kill you.
There are 4 different types of blood: A, B, AB, and O.
Patient in room 216 needs a transfusion right away.
I'll give it to him. I'm his brother. Stanley! He's dead!
Yes, but he wouldn't be if we'd been more scientific about it. Brother or no brother, what he needs is type A. And the right blood donor for him could belong to any race, since the 4 blood types appear in all races.
Today we know there are probably hundreds of blood types. Some of them are considered major and some of them are considered minor blood groups. But be that as it may, there's an identification system and nature is telling us something. Nature is telling us that my blood is specific, and so is yours. And you've evolved from all the other people before you to have that specific blood. Blood has a number of different cells that circulate within it. There are red blood cells that carry oxygen. There are platelets that intervene and create coagulation and clotting when it's necessary. Our blood circulates through hundreds of miles of capillaries, arteries, veins. It goes from a major central canal, the aorta, much like the main canal in Venice, down to smaller side streets, arterioles, eventually to the little tiny neighborhood canals. When you get down to these localized little flowing areas of the bloodstream, that's where the real action occurs in terms of transfer of oxygen. The beauty of the circulatory system is to take the oxygen that we breathe in from the external atmosphere and get it out to our farthest little pinky or toe and get it delivered when it's needed.
The great Max Perutz, right, who won a Nobel Prize for his incredible insights into hemoglobin, even he went to the grave fighting views on hemoglobin, and his views were by no means accepted. That's perhaps not so well known. Those in the know that there are aspects to the story that remain to be understood, and those aspects couldn't be fully understood within the simple frameworks that most of us can regurgitate. So hemoglobin has been a battleground of science for many, many a year.
The oxygen in the air we breathe is exposed to the red cells in our lungs.
Yes.
The red cells carry the oxygen to the tissues because the red cells contain hemoglobin.
Now let's look at that hemoglobin for just a moment. That is a word made up of 2 parts, hemo and globin. And the hemo means blood, and the globin comes from the word globulin, which means the protein materials in the blood.
There are discoveries, right, that lead one to understand that red cells are important for oxygen delivery. And that was a very early discovery because people could see red blood cells. And they investigated that and found that hemoglobin was the player important in the delivery of gases. It would release oxygen, it would release carbon dioxide. It was really a simple extrapolation then that giving back red blood cells would make people better. There's something really missing in this biology.
The simplicity of just taking liquid from one individual and entering into another clearly is not simple at all.
One of the great fallacies that's occurred in medicine all around this religion of blood transfusion is that by giving a unit of red blood cells, one improves oxygen delivery to the tissues. When we transfuse a unit of red blood cells, the tissue delivery of oxygen to critical organs actually drops. It becomes worse rather than better.
Max Perutz did say that science is truth, and he has had an enormous impact on the way I think. I think all the time that there is no chance that I can trick nature here. We like to say that the respiratory cycle is really a three-gas system. The Handbook of Respiratory Physiology, the classic text, will include our model of a three-gas respiratory cycle. So we missed a gas. Hemoglobin doesn't just ferry oxygen from lungs to tissues and CO2 back, carbon dioxide back to the lungs, but it carries this third gas, nitric oxide, in a protected form, and it releases the nitric oxide together with oxygen. The nitric oxide then dilates the blood vessels so that the oxygen can get to the tissues. What turns out is that our blood banks are deficient in nitric oxide. When you store blood in the blood bank, the red cells lose their nitric oxide, and they are therefore unable to dilate blood vessels, and oxygen delivery to tissues is thereby impaired. So the world's blood supply is deficient in nitric oxide, and those red cells do not seem able to deliver oxygen in the same way as a fresh red blood cell is capable of.
When you cut your finger, you start bleeding. That blood, if you just let it drip, will at some point coagulate. Understanding the coagulation system is a mystery. How does the coagulation system know only to clot at the point of injury and not clot throughout? Not only do we not understand the intricacies of this system, but in fact, we're just now starting to understand that the coagulation cascade and looking at very simplistic diagrams of how the coagulation system is activated, through which every physician and nurse has to learn by heart, it probably doesn't exist in nature, and we know probably just the tip of the iceberg.
Я люблю, когда есть свободное время, смотреть познавательные передачи по телевидению, и в том числе BBC есть замечательная передача о животных. И вот в одной из передач я увидел, что происходит с волком, которого там при драке ранили другие волки, и у него кровопотеря. Значит, он ложится, зализывает рану, то есть останавливает кровотечение. Второе, он ползет к ручью, чтобы напиться воды. Это значит, что такое? Восстановить объем циркулирующей крови. И третье, он ползет в тихую нору, где отлеживается, то есть создает себе покой. Вот три основных момента. И я понял, что мы, врачи, должны тоже следовать у пациентов этим трем моментам основным.
When we store blood in the blood bank, it's not like storing a fine red wine that you want it to become more complex.
Why does blood stored in blood banks seem to be associated with so many adverse outcomes, including heart attacks, organ failure, and death? If one stores red blood cells, other bad things happen. They actually change their shape. They become more rigid. The blood bag is filled with acid and ions like potassium, which cause injury. You can imagine that rigid red blood cells and deformed red blood cells moving through those tiny, small vessels might plug them up and make things worse.
When these red cells are donated, they're put in a plastic bag. It's not good news for a red cell to be put in a blood bank. The side effects that occur with patients, the adverse events, are more common if your blood is more than, say, 14 days old.
In the 80s, it was infectious disease. Now people are talking about the age of these products. As they sit on the shelf and become older and older and older, these products degrade. And the product that is in red blood cells that's 40 days old as opposed to 14 days old are very different products, and the accumulating data would suggest they have very different effects on patients. And that's going to be true for plasma, and that's going to be true for platelets. So I actually think in World War II they were correct, where they gave whole blood, fresh whole blood to patients that had been stored for up to less than 14 days.
If you go and you approach the blood banking industry, particularly in the United States, and you say, well, we're going to have fresh whole blood available, and I want it warm fresh whole blood, in other words, less than 24 hours old, the fear that occurs is immense, because there's not a system, there's not even a vision or a desire to say, how can we get there?
We do know that a unit of blood transfused has an impact, whether it's through white cells or red cells themselves, or potentially the plasma that's being transfused with that unit of red cells, have an immune effect.
Hay riesgos de infección, sobre todo en la transfusión de plaquetas, que no han podido ser minimizados a pesar de todo el cuidado que se ha tenido y todo el rigor con que se trata la sangre. Y hay riesgo en este momento de inmunomodulación, cuya magnitud desconocemos porque probablemente se van a ver a lo largo de los años, en años más.
Scientists looked at patients that were transfused for orthopedic surgery, so they had no other comorbidities. And those transfused for this particular surgeries, 10 years later, had an increased incidence of lymphoproliferative disease. They had lymphomas. The surgeons don't care what will happen 10 years later to their patient because they're not going to see him. I think this knowledge should be given more and more to the clinicians to realize that it's not just the immediate effect that they're seeing, that there are side effects that may come along much later. That's another reason that we should be very cautious about transfusion and only use it if it's really life-saving.
In America, we must make doubly sure no person is held to account for a crime he or she did not commit. So we are dramatically expanding the use of DNA evidence to prevent wrongful conviction.
One of the underappreciated facts about blood transfusion is that if you get my blood, you will now have my DNA. There's some fascinating data that has come out in the last 10 years, where a group of physicians took a look back at World War II veterans who were transfused during World War II. And guess what? A significant percentage of them, over 25%, actually had DNA from a different person circulating in their body. There's been a number of studies shown that if you give a blood transfusion without reducing out the white cells, and still in the United States, 50% of our blood is given without reducing the white cells, you will become what is called a chimera. You will become a blended animal. You will no longer be a single, distinct human being. You will be a multi-DNA'd animal carrying somebody else's DNA. How long? We don't know, but it's fascinating from the World War II group of veterans that still, some 50 years later, they still carry the DNA of the person that they were transfused from. We know today that a number of rare diseases are carried in your DNA. Your propensity for getting lymphoma, leukemia, something else, cancers may be affected by this. Your transmission of this may lead to any number of other diseases moving through a population. It's never been studied, nor do we have the foggiest notion about the effect of blood transfusion on what we call the epigenetics, the movement of these genes through a population.
Unlike marriage, transfusion is for life, and there is some data showing that women who have no Y chromosome, since women have two X's, any of the white cells that are detected in their bloodstream devoid of any Y chromosome, yet after being transfused for hemorrhage, you can detect these Y chromosomes now because some of the units of blood they received from male donors, you can detect these units of blood in the Y chromosome in the circulating blood of these women for years after the transfusion. We assume that because of the ability of white cells to reproduce since they have DNA, the recipient has a signature from the donor for life in their bloodstream. The clinical implications clearly are yet to be determined.
On a newsreel for the first time, those almost legendary figures, the Chindits. Masters in guerrilla warfare, they've taught the Japanese to fear the swift striking columns of elusive fighting men who wage war after their own fashion deep in the Burma jungle.
During the war, there was a very remarkable doctor called Raphael Marcus. He was a doctor operating with what became known as the Chindits in the Burma campaign, operating behind the Japanese lines. It was a long-range group. And he found himself in the jungle treating injuries of the utmost severity with only the most basic, really basic. They scarcely had anesthetic. And he certainly didn't have any blood. And he learned to save lives doing surgery without blood. And when the war ended, he came back to Liverpool and he completed his formal qualifications. He's got his fellowship of the Royal College of Surgeons. And he was a pioneer of carrying out surgery without blood. Indeed, the British Medical Journal gave him a great tribute in his obituary that was published in that BMJ.
In the Pacific, one of the most ubiquitous fruits out there is coconut. The Japanese discovered as a substitute for plasma infusion, coconut water. When the fruit is young, there is lots of water, up to about half a liter, contained inside the coconut and sterile. One of the eyes was punctured with a sterile needle, and this water could then be infused into either an injured combatant or someone who was sick and dehydrated.
Within a minute, a launched grenade or a mortar, I'm not sure, landed about 4 feet away and killed a couple of soldiers and severely wounded a photographer friend, Cambodian, I was with, and wounded me very badly in the right leg, particularly. Once they got me clear of the fighting, they saw that I was losing a lot of blood, and they gave me a direct transfusion of coconut milk, straight from the tree.
A night of sustained fighting followed by thunderous artillery fire at dawn. Barrage after barrage descended on the South Ossetian capital Skin Valley.
Тоже весь мир теперь знает эту трагедию, когда 28 августа 2008 года ночью грузинская сторона начала массированный обстрел из тяжелого вооружения города Цхинвал. Через нас проходили раненые, которые поступали из района боевых действий. Значит, за 5 дней 212 раненых прошло. Это все тяжелые минно-осколочные ранения, это пулевые ранения. Из них примерно 50% это с тяжелой кровопотерей более 75%. Запасов крови у нас не было никаких и компонентов крови. Когда мы оцениваем действия те или иные, вот в экстремальных ситуациях, то есть сколько погибло больных, это самый главный критерий. Правильно мы оказывали помощь или неправильно. Я могу с гордостью сказать за всех своих коллег о том, что из тех, кого мы транспортировали в клинике Владикавказа, во время транспортировки ни один больной не погиб.
We live in a different world today than we did 10, 15 years ago. Today, there are both many natural disasters, and then there are the man-made disasters of terrorist events. We learned from 9/11 that blood is really a homeland security issue, in that when 9/11 occurred, there was no movement of blood throughout the United States, and you needed to move blood throughout the United States to be able to do the HIV and hepatitis testing. So essentially, modern medical care in the United States came crashing to a halt.
東北の大地震、こういう津波による震災の場合に、多くの救急医療を要する患者さんがおられましたが、そうした点では献血による輸血の供給、そうしたものが非常に遅れて、十分な供給ができなかったということは確かです。その点で、やはり多くの援助と、それから組織だった医療が必要だったということは確かです。
Today, we ought to really think about innovation, about ways that we can get away from this feeling of immediately triggering a transfusion whenever somebody sees red blood coming out on the floor of an operating room or an emergency room.
The standard of practice are a range of therapeutic interventions that are appropriate for some medical condition or other. There's usually not just one way in which you can treat a patient. There are several. And the great thing about the standard of practice is that they emerge typically out of a lot of thinking and a lot of experimentation. There's an evidence base backing them up.
The concept of evidence-based medicine is a relatively new term in medical practice, and what it really means is that in order to ensure that the right thing is being done, there should be a basis in fact for what the therapy or the intervention is going to be.
This concept of tradition-based practice and evidence-based practice is quite the rage right now in transfusion medicine for the trauma patient.
I am not of the mind that in every circumstance, transfusion in trauma is beneficial. And in fact, there are data in the literature to suggest that even transfusing patients bleeding from trauma leads to adverse outcomes.
When we study groups of patients that have been transfused, they have a higher incidence of such things as infections after surgery, recurrence of cancer, lung disease and lung problems. Now, it's very tempting for all of us to then say, well, so it's proven, it's a cause and effect. But just by the way that kind of medical research is done, you cannot call cause and effect. However, let me point out to you that there is a place in the world where we've made that association, and we have never done controlled randomized trials, and that's smoking.
What cigarette do you smoke, Doctor?
Tens of thousands of doctors in all branches of medicine, in all parts of the country, were asked that question.
What cigarette do you smoke, Doctor?
The brand named most was Camel. Yes, surveys show more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette.
Smoke Camels, the cigarette so many doctors enjoy.
Does anybody watching this film have any doubt that smoking is related to lung cancer and emphysema. Yet, we've never taken two groups of patients, given them cigarettes or not, and said smoke for 50 years and let's see who comes out better.
Can we give a transfusion and not hurt you? Can we do a clinical trial and demonstrate that a transfusion is no worse than not giving a transfusion? Or that you can transfuse more and not make you worse than transfuse less? No one has ever said, let me give a transfusion and show that you could do better. No study is designed like that. The issues we're dealing with are just, frankly, very large, very big. And this is hard to do without being challenged.
When doctors don't know whether what they're doing is harming the patient or not, okay, they have an obligation to find out. In addition, there's also a common understanding of how you adjudicate, how you settle disagreements like this. How do you settle disagreements when there is what Benjamin Friedman has called clinical equipoise, okay? That is, you've got an absence of conclusive evidence showing the superiority or non-inferiority of one or another of these things, okay? And you've got practical disagreement among clinicians, okay? And yet one remains inside the standard of practice and the other is outside of it, okay? So how do you settle it? A randomized clinical trial.
Transfusion medicine suffers from not having a well-founded scientific basis for the use of the therapy. And because of that, there are gaps in communication. Patients are not fully informed because there's not necessarily the information available to support the recommendation.
In traditional medical schools, you would get less than a week's instruction out of a 4 to 6 year medical course on transfusion practice and transfusion medicine.
Patients have the right to know a great deal of information about what's going to be done to them, what advantages that they can expect, what disadvantages might be on the horizon also, and what the alternatives are, okay? And if the doctor isn't forthcoming in telling them that information, they have every right to ask and to expect that the doctor will recognize his or her obligation to provide that information.
There is a clear legal duty on the physician to offer, if there are the two alternatives, one is invasive and the other is less invasive, the duty is to offer and explain and make available the less invasive alternative. The maxim is very simple, actually. It's summed up in 4 words. Doctors advise, patients decide.
Say money. Money.
Englewood Hospital and Medical Center is celebrating a major achievement. It's been awarded a nearly $4.7 million Defense Department grant to teach military doctors what it knows about bloodless medicine and surgery.
We were contacted by the Special Ops, both Air Force and Navy, to help in terms of what they found out or knew is that we were able to treat patients for whom blood was not an option with great success despite the very low hemoglobins they had.
Я понимаю после беседы с вами, что и в Америке, и в России есть врачи, ретрограды, которые за то, чтобы переливать кровь, и есть те прогрессивные, которые говорят, что надо все больше и больше отказываться от переливания крови. А критерии к этому, наверное, да не наверное, это точно, и у вас, и у нас сейчас одни и те же, которые вытекают из доказательной медицины, что надо отказываться от переливания крови.
Medicine is based upon a risk-benefit ratio. Every decision I make as a physician should, you would think, be based upon my in-depth weighing of the evidence of I'm going to do more good than harm if I take the following therapy. You know, the standard Hippocratic oath is do no harm. First, doctor, do no harm.